Fratricide, an Amoni Ram story, Part 1. I've said this before, and it's certainly a point that's going to continue to be repeated as time goes on, but the SCP universe has expanded quite a lot over the years, from its humble beginnings of creepy monsters. Whether that's a good thing is of course going to be a matter of personal opinion, but when a universe continues to be fleshed out, there's obviously going to be all manner of stories told. While the Church of the Broken God started out as a creepy cult that worshipped machines, we now have various expansive takes on their history and mythos. The history of Amoni Ram, the Mechanites' greatest city, is one paved largely in blood, and while one of the SCP-001 proposals took a look at the city mostly in the modern day, there's still a lot of history left to be uncovered. The story we're going to be looking at today takes place many years in the past, when Amoni Ram was still in its prime. While there are anomalous elements to the story, of course, it's a tale grounded enough in real-world concepts and emotions. I'll be reading most of this tale verbatim, but I will be paraphrasing certain elements, mostly dialogue, so of course I recommend reading the full story yourself to get the complete experience. Let's take a look. Chapter 1. The two princes chased each other around the courtyard. The palace's inner walls sheltered them, dappled sunlight falling across the tilework and fountains, across the gold mosaics and orange facades. They panted, laughed, shrieked, the younger running after the older until, limber and long-legged, he tackled his brother to the ground, both falling in a heap. When he opened his mouth to laugh again, he tasted copper. He pressed a hand to his mouth, looking at it in disbelief. Blood. His nose was twisted, gushing blood freely. For a moment he didn't realize what had happened, until he looked up and saw his brother's eyes turned cold and sharp, foulard fist streaked with red. In a second, their nursemaids swept in with their long flowing dresses, one hastily separating the two boys while the others pressed cloths to his face to stem the flow, clucking and fussing over him. The last thing the prince saw before the nursemaids crowded around him, blocking his view, was the sharp, offended eyes of his brother. How dare you? How dare you? The field had been so very deafening a few hours ago. Now it was painfully quiet and still. No more captains shouting orders, no more Deva pushing the line. Just a sea of dead bodies, knee-deep and horizon far. Mechanites mixed with Deva, mixed with beasts, mixed with nobody at all. Blood and oil flowing freely into the dirt, mixing into a thick red mud. It coated everything. The severed foulard limbs lying in the mire, the bleached and burned skulls of the war beasts, Biliath's golden armor as she picked her way through the endless carcasses, the men she commanded, and the men she killed. Vultures danced overhead, patiently waiting to have their turn. They always got their turn, nowadays. A Deva corpse shuddered to her right. She didn't hesitate, plunging the tip of her sword into its soft nape. The flesh gave way, the bone rent, and it gave a final death rattle before falling still again. She wiped the sword on the body's tunic before returning to her slow march across the field. No prisoners, Kabar had told her. No prisoners and no quarter. Anyone who fell, died. Never mind that the Deva had no regard for their own lives and would fight to the last man, prisoner or otherwise. Never mind that the bodies they left were easy fodder for the man-eaters later. It was fine. The legions followed her word, not his. She would, quietly, give the order to burn the bodies when the mud, thick with blood, receded. Kabar would rage silently, but he would not do anything. To her, anyway. She spied another body twitching a few feet away and gingerly stepped between dead, tangled limbs to approach it. A wet crunch. Her foot landed on the head of a half-transformed Deva, face formed into a horrific visage. The viscera sprayed across her once shining greaves. She grimaced and raised her sword again. Behind her, as the sun set, she could hear horns carried over the wind. The siege of Tarat continued. It was the latest front in the First War, the crusade waged against the aggressor nations in defense of the borders of the Empire. They had pushed back against the Deva's incursion, setting fire to the jungles the sorcerers raised as defense. The fire spread virulently, from tree to tree, copse to copse, forest to forest, vast swath of jungle to jungle, until there were only vast plains of ash, charred bodies twisted in agony. Every spear length of land they retook from the Deva was paid for in gallons of mechanite blood. But it was paid for in full, and they took their righteous prize. And now they had pushed the monstrosities back all the way here, to Tarat, a fortress city resting between two rivers at the point where they pushed closest to one another, not quite touching. A wide, shallow city, and in the spring thaw the rivers became impassable rapids, a natural barrier. Biliath had pleaded with Kabar to hold the siege until winter, when the glaciers feeding the rivers would refreeze and the water would become passable, maybe even frozen thick enough to move troops and siege engines over, if they were lucky. He had ignored her, of course, so she had enlisted Haram's help. He was her opposite, Kabar's left hand as she was his right. The general of the expeditionary armies, he and his forces had been pushing in the far east, carving a bloody path across the southern lands of the Nalka and the northern borders of the Deva, pushing west until they met the Golden Legion at Tarat. Haram came from the east, Biliath came from the west, and the city and its defenders squeezed between their armies, they had pled with Kabar to hold the siege for a few months. From his tent on the hill overlooking the city, he had looked at them. Stocky, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, the piercing golden eyes marking him as a Bumaro, now laid upon the two of them. Haram went first, telling his lord that his forces tire, waging bloody war in a foreign land. They have not seen the temples of Kaya Ram in many years, and the towers of Amoni Ram in even longer. He fears that they will not be able to take the city for many months. Downhill, the armies were camped, thousands of men sitting in the mud around sparse fires, setting up canvas tents and wool cots to rest their heads for a few precious hours. Haram spoke truth. They were the bravest of the Empire, and still they were exhausted after an endless, bloody campaign. The prince had cocked his head, face impassive. The inside of his tent was cast alight by the setting sun, rays bouncing across the treasures seized from the Deva during this campaign. Wooden shields inlaid with gold, intricate carvings of war beasts and marble statuettes of elephants, polished blades and spears made for hands much larger than a man. The tiger skin rug the two generals stood on as Prince Kabar sat in a stolen throne completed the image. Seizing the silence, Biliath offered her support, stating her agreement that their infantries are depleted. She bit her tongue for a moment before continuing, telling Kabar that their mechanical corps are down to the last few men, and they only have one functional Goliath, cobbled from parts from the fallen. She questions their ability to hold a siege. The sun inched down the horizon before Kabar spoke, asking if their forces feared dying in the name of their emperor. She could practically hear Haram's teeth grind, and she interjected before he could say anything. She assures the prince that that's not the case, but death now is not worth anything, not when they still have a long campaign ahead of them. They must conserve their resources. The prince, however, replies that they must take Tarat. They must make sure the Deva know that they cannot hide behind their walls of stone and root until their enemies turn tail and run back to their nest to lick their wounds. Haram argues that the Deva have stores of fruit and grain for years and can easily make more, so they cannot simply starve them out. Kabar counters that they will instead burn them out, with siege engines bombarding the city with burning pitch day and night. Biliath points out that the sorcerer Nawabs will repel them, and as Kabar states that they will distract them with direct assaults, Haram exasperatedly argues that they don't have the men. Kabar, however, casually says that they will fight for him or they will be put to the sword, as will Haram if he raises his voice to him again. He cares little for his victories in the east if he cannot obey his betters. Haram was silent for a moment before bowing, apologizing to his lord. Kabar tells them to go and marshal their armies, as he wants the siege engines set up on the hill before the sun rises. Haram departs, and Biliath turns to follow him when Kabar calls out to her. He states that he expects some insubordination from his men, but she would do well to remember her future after this campaign. There is no room for insubordination in the palace walls. She bowed her head and slipped away. That had been many months ago. Now their heels were dug in, and the siege continued unabated into the beginning of summer. Biliath's hopes that the summer would bring a dry run proved fatally incorrect. The waters of the river rose up as the glacier thawed even faster. The mud and dirt wore and washed away, and one night the banks collapsed, sending half a dozen camps tumbling into the rapids. Before anyone could do anything, the screaming soldiers were snatched by the rushing water, slammed over and over again into the sharp rocks the Deva had placed downriver. She had no idea how long they took to die, but prayed it had been quickly. Morale in the camp grew worse after that, if such a thing was possible. The misery was daily now. Foodstuffs were dwindling. Some of her lieutenants were debating slaughtering their mounts. In the day, soldiers would dig through the newly replenished battlefields for mechanite corpses and drag them back to bury them. And every night when the sun set and the fires across the camp came to life, the battle would begin again. The siege engines, with their deafening combustion, would begin casting balls of burning pitch over the walls into Tarat. The sorcerer Nawabs would return fire with fist-sized balls of venomous thorns cast down onto the legion by the hundreds, as another force would rush whatever part of the walls they felt were weak that day. The Deva pikemen on the walls would stab from above, piercing flesh and foulade. Screaming was the symphony of battle. And all the while, Biliath and Haram sat a mile behind the line, safely in camp, while their men fought and died. They drew their plans and maps and adjusted force counts, hearing the distant shouting and screaming. They stared at each other over the map when a particularly devastating round of screams sounded out. Haram begins to voice a concern, but Biliath just shakes her head. Kabar had ordered them back, that they were more valuable making the plans and leaving the common soldiers to die for them. He'd said it so casually, as though death in these numbers was not just a consequence, but an unforgettable component of the battle. And of course, he'd ordered her back in particular, stroking her cheek with his still flesh right hand. I couldn't risk my hawk breaking her wings, said so softly that it made her blood boil and her skin crawl. But she had simply nodded and returned to her quarters. So there they were, in the command tent, looking at each other completely helpless as their armies screamed and bled and fought and died. Haram insists that they were meant to lead, and she agrees, as he sighs and puts his dagger down on the table. He asks her if she walked the fields last night, to which she nods, stating, "No prisoners. Not anymore." He tells her to go rest then, and he'll hold the command, but she argues that she's not going to sleep while her men get massacred. Haram remarks that with this prince, she'd never sleep again. It was a seditious comment, maybe, but one she couldn't deny the truth of. The exhaustion was there, encroaching on her now that the adrenaline was wearing off. Dark edges to her vision, her prosthetics weightier than ever. She eventually relents, stating that she'll sleep for a few hours, and Haram nods. She could see the exhaustion on his face, too. He wasn't young, but he wasn't old enough to warrant the lines of worry that had been etched under his eyes. Some small part of her wondered what she looked like now, whether it was the same face she had when she'd set out from Amoni Ram. She put the thoughts away for later and slipped out of the command tent. Her own tent was at the edge of the camp. She was afforded some privileges from her position, privacy among them. She didn't trust herself to stay in the air this tired, so she made the trek on foot, stomping through the mud and weaving between the labyrinth of tents and campfires. The soldiers from the units not involved in the attacks were kneeling, warming themselves, eating what rations they could get their hands on. Seeing her approach, they scrambled to their knees to salute, but she waved them down. No point disturbing what little rest they'd get. They settled for weakly raising their fists in a salute, one she returned before passing. Then she stumbled backward, pushed to the side. It was a small group of prisoners. 3 or 4 Deva, dressed in rags and manacled together. Their heads were bowed as they were led along by soldiers. She was going to call out for them to stop until she registered the red-dyed capelet on their shoulders. Imperial guards, not for her to command. That was impossible. They weren't supposed to take prisoners. But she watched them go back the way she had come, torches disappearing into the darkness. One of the prisoners turned for a second, locking eyes with her. She started. He was young, far too young to be a soldier. His face was almost bestial, half transformed into the Deva spirit, jaws drawn back to reveal razor-sharp teeth, curly-haired and dark-skinned, but eyes distinctly rich and brown and human. Then he turned away, and they were gone. She jostled the soldier nearest her, asking where they're going, but he simply replies that he doesn't know. She narrowed her eyes and turned, heading to her tent. It was a small space, but it was distinctly hers. The soldiers respected her. No one would think to enter without her permission, so she had no fear of her possessions being disturbed. It was simple. Her cot, chest, canvas-wrapped weapons, a few mementos from home. A handful of trophies, nothing as ostentatious as Kabar's war loot, but just a few memorable objects she had squirreled away, to remind her where she had gone and what she had accomplished. A Deva wood sword, thorns torn from the tree beast she had felled, a little statuette of a dancing scarlet god, and her favorite, a large cage made from finely woven wood containing a number of small forest beasts. They were odd little creatures, the size and shape of frogs, but with 6 legs and mouths full of sharp teeth. They glowed in the darkness. They were contraband, and no doubt she'd be punished if Kabar found them, but they were her little rebellion. Closing the tent flap behind her, she shook a pinch of dried crumbled meat into their enclosure and watched as the 4 or 5 of them emerged from the sticks and moss she had carefully arranged for them and went for the food. The biggest got there first and bullied the others, pushing them around and snapping its jaws menacingly at its brothers as it ate. When it had gotten its fill and wandered off, she shook in another pinchful for the stragglers. Then she collapsed into bed. Back in the command tent, drawing maps for the next assault, Haram comments that he doesn't know how she suffers him. She lets his comment hang in the air for a moment before addressing it, stating that it's her duty. He responds by asking if it's her duty to follow the commands of a blind, spoiled oaf who knows nothing about war. And when she replies that she wouldn't say that he knows nothing, he concedes that he does know how to kill his men. She quickly admonishes him, not in Kabar's honor, but purely out of concern that someone might hear. He acknowledges that with a nod, at least, and asks if she heard the reports from last night's assault on the southern flank of the city. He tells her 400, which she assumes to be injured, but that's the number that died, with twice that many injured. It was an eye-watering number, and she didn't speak for a second, before asking the goddess to forgive them. He really doesn't know how long they can sustain this, as disease is tearing through their ranks almost as quickly as the Deva are. She replies that they don't have a choice, but he retorts that there's always a choice. Biliath's gaze settled on him, and she asks what he's talking about. He replies that when he was a youth in the Legion, when she would have been but a child, they were waging a campaign against the rebels at Amoni Ram. It was a bloody affair. None of them knew how to make war against other Mechanites, not really. And of course, there's nothing worse for morale than killing your kinsmen. Many of them died on those fields. Too many. He paused for a second, lost somewhere else, before continuing. Eventually, they had the rebels in a position where they were willing to try and execute their commandant for surrender and leniency. They served them with an offer. He was a lieutenant then, and all of the lieutenants brought it to their captain. He listened to the surrender offer very patiently. Then he reached out and took it, and tossed it into the fire. Announced to all of their shocked faces that they would not accept a surrender, and that he would have the commandant's head on his pike before granting an inch of mercy to any traitor of the Empire. Biliath asked what happened, even though she knew the answer. The tale was rumor and mythology in the Legion, oft whispered and never confirmed. She just hadn't realized Haram was its origin. He replies that they roused the next morning to find him in his tent, throat slit and bleeding like a stuck pig. A rebel traitor must have snuck into the camp at night and cut him down. He said it bluntly and dispassionately. She states aloud about the rebel traitor, almost as a question, and Haram just says, yes. It hung in the air, weighty and full of implication. She says to him to not tell her something that she cannot let herself come to know. He nods slowly and apologizes, saying that he forgets her position, to which she replies that she does as well. They were silent again until a messenger burst through the tent flap, announcing a summons, Biliath to Kabar's camp. She swallowed the pit that suddenly found itself in her stomach and exchanged looks with Haram. In Kabar's tent, he picks at a roasted cut of meat in front of him, barely acknowledging Biliath's presence, while asking her if she's heard the casualty report from last night. He states that the casualties are unfortunate, but inevitable, and he questions the efficacy of the plans that she and General Haram are devising if these are the consequences. But of course, those things are their domain. Biliath silences the scream she wanted to let out, and he continues, stating that they need a relief force, and asking how quickly she can make it to Amoni Ram. Her heart stopped, struck by a bolt of wild hope. She willed it back to life, not wanting to betray the momentary lapse in impassion. She replies that if she hurries and is able to catch a good wind, 4 days, or perhaps 3. Kabar asks if Haram will be able to hold the line without her, and she nods, silently, not wanting to say anything that might convince him to change his mind. He thought for a moment, then motioned her to a ceramic data cylinder sitting on a table. He tells her to deliver the reinforcement orders to General Maleen at the garrison in Amoni Ram, but not to wait to lead the relief force here, as he wants her back here as soon as possible. She may trust Haram to lead, but he does not. Her heart was singing. She stomped it down and nodded obediently, dispassionately. Kabar rose from his seat, approaching her. She stood ramrod straight and death still as he raised her chin with a foulard finger. He tells her to take comfort, as the sooner this siege ends, the sooner he returns to Amoni Ram, a conqueror, with her at his side. His father will formally abdicate the throne to him, and he will be free to take his Shahanshah as his concubine, as is his birthright. Crown Empress, if she's good. She nodded, eyes lowered, as it was the only way he wouldn't see the burning rage in her eyes. She thanks him, stating that she looks forward to it, and he dismisses her, returning to his meal. I don't know how you suffer him, really. Haram's words echoed in her head from the moment she ran full tilt to the edge of the camp and leaped off the cliff, wings spreading wide to catch the updraft and rocketing her high into the air, to the hours spent utterly alone, gliding along the desert winds with the hawks and the falcons as the dunes shifted endlessly beneath her, left behind in record time. I don't know how you suffer him, really. It bounced around her as the desert below gave way to farms and sandstone houses, and then she crested a vast hill, and then it was in front of her. Amoni Ram, Gate of the West, Adatum's answer. High walls surrounding the city and sunlight reflecting off the skyscraping towers, gleaming bronze and proud, off the shimmering foulard of the palace's facades, off the armor of a new legion marshaled outside the city gates, blinding sunlight forcing her to cover her eyes as she swept into the city of her birth, the city she loved, the city she'd left behind. She swung low through the air, abandoning the birds, coming in over the city walls where the guardsmen greeted her with a cheer and a salute. She returned. I don't know how you suffer him, really. It raced in her head as she raced, wings spread through the alleys formed from the sandstone and foulard and steel buildings. The crowd spread out beneath her. More refugees than normal, maybe, but still happy crowds, reassured that they were safe in the greatest city on earth, as they partook in the bazaars and prayers to Meccain and 10,000 other things that the metropolis offered. They looked up as her winged form shot overhead, weaving around pipes and about corners. I don't know how you suffer him, really. It dominated her thoughts as she quickly found herself at the garrison, filled with armored soldiers and officers, finding a meeting with the general in residence and handing over the memory cylinder before apologizing, but she really had to go now, and she would be more than happy to discuss the news from the front tomorrow over tea. And then taking her leave, again into the air, but this time away from the garrison and away from the palace, to a familiar skyscraper. She landed, hanging from the building's side, one hand gripping the metal frame of the window as she folded her wings, popped the latches on the glass, and clambered in. And the thought departed from her head entirely when, rounding a corner in the expensively decorated apartment, she laid eyes on the tall, thin man as he turned from the books he was poring over. His mouth fell open in surprise, even as his eyes lit up, and she rushed him, catching him in a bone-crushingly tight hug as he did the same. Anul Bomaro, second prince of Amoni Ram, high scholar of the imperial cult, the White Prince, kissed his beloved. The palace complex at the heart of Amoni Ram was a vast, labyrinthine thing. It spiraled out from the central throne room. It contained hundreds of rooms and dozens of courtyards, beautiful lush gardens, before the war of course, masterful artworks and mosaics commissioned from craftsmen and artisans across the empire. One could spend a lifetime inside and not see everything it had to offer. Anul had left at 16. He preferred the relative peace and privacy of one of the grand towers. It gave him quiet, solitude time to focus on his studies and his works. His parents had been unhappy, but Kabar had argued on his behalf. His older brother had taken their father aside, telling him the boy needed time to come into himself, just as Kabar had found himself on the battlefield. Anul was no warrior, they both knew that much. He might as well give him the space he needed to discover what he was instead. The Emperor, still sound of mind back then, had grudgingly let him go. He was still in the city, close enough for the Imperial Guard to keep an eye on. The boy would return sooner or later anyway. That had been 15 years ago. Now the apartment had only expanded, Anul taking over the entire floor and converting it into his study and workspace. Every spare scrap of space was occupied by an ancient text or stone tablet or innovation in progress. Steel and copper and foulade constructions and wires, their states of completion as unknown as their purpose. He hurriedly cleared some off of a long chaise, guiding her to a seat. He rushed around the messy kitchenette, grabbing a crystal pitcher of clean water and 2 metal cups. Anul remarks that he wasn't told that she was coming, otherwise he would have prepared, but she smiles and says that she didn't know either, as it was an unexpected change in plans. He asks if that means the siege has broken and she's coming home, his hopeful face making her heart sink. She replies that no, Tambarat's walls are as strong as ever. He then asks how that can be, as Haram has had a chokehold on the city for almost half a year now, and he can't imagine any city being able to hold out against him for long. He talked about Haram with an affectionate lilt in his voice. The general had practically raised the boys after the Emperor's illness, though they hadn't seen each other in years now. She replies that they aren't free to command their forces as they see fit. But Anul says that the Deva still should have long since raised the flag of surrender and opened the gates. Biliath then replies that there will be no surrender, and when Anul asks what she means, she hesitates, and he picks up on it. She explains that Prince Kabar has given the order for no quarter, so there will be no surrender, no negotiation, no prisoners. Ansul's brow furrows, and he asks what happens then when they break the defenses. Her silence said it all. His face fell, and they sat in quiet for a few moments. He asks why he would do that, to which she says she couldn't say. Anul then says that he's sure that he has his reasons, but there's another lapse into silence, this time broken by Biliath, who says that she was only dispatched here as a messenger to deliver the reinforcement order to the garrison. She told Prince Kabar that she could make it to Amoni Ram in 3 days, but she did it in 2, and she'll need a day of rest before she can make the return journey. Anul smiles, remarking that it gives them a precious few hours together. He leaned forward, forehead pressed against hers, the foulade fingers of his left hand snaking up and interlocking with hers. She replies that they should make the most of them, fingertips peeling off his craftsman glove and pulling him up off the chaise. When Anul woke up, it was well into the night. He blinked himself awake, the implant of his left eye quickly cycling itself into motion as he extricated himself from the sheets wrapping around him. In the darkness, he saw a figure on the balcony. Biliath turned her head back as he came up behind her, placing the blanket around her shoulders. He tells her that it's a cold night and she might catch something. She nodded once in appreciation, then turned back. They both leaned against the railing of the balcony, looking out at the cityscape. From this high up, Amoni Ram revealed itself as the city of ants that it was. Massive golden towers rising high above a maze-like inner city. Sandstone homes built on temples, built on shops, built on ruins older than anyone alive. Bright electric lights burning and gasping, illuminating the crowds, each man or woman smaller than the head of a pin, but grouping in schools, ceaselessly moving through the boulevards and alleys, a staggering performance of mass civilization. He comments on the city's beauty, and she replies that it's why she fights. To protect these crowds, these people. To protect this. Her hands snaked across the railing to clasp his. He tells her that it takes a noble soul to leave their home to protect it from their enemies. They owe her a debt that cannot be repaid, her and every soldier that dies in the campaigns. She sighed, replying that she worries that she'll end up like them, meeting her death in a faraway heathen land, not in the city of her birth. He tells her that she'll be home before long, but she says that it won't be the same. When she returns home, it will be at the side of a conqueror as his empress. Amoni Ram will not be her home, it will be her domain. Ansul's face fell, and he says that they don't have to think about that now. She smiles sadly and says that he doesn't have to. He can move on to the next thing. Always the next thing. It's nothing for him. Prince Ansul will find a nice girl from the court to marry, eventually. This is a pleasant memory for him to look back on one day. It just hasn't ended yet. He shakes his head, arguing that that's not true, but she says that it is. There is no way out of it. He is as bound by his station as she is, and surely he doesn't think that they could carry this on after his brother's coronation. Ansul replies that he could talk to him. They love each other, and he'll have his pick of the court ladies as emperor, so he wouldn't rob his brother of love. Biliath almost laughed, stating that he hasn't spoken to his brother in years. The front has changed him, made him harder, if such a thing is possible. Ansul counters that that's just the aura he must project, as commander, as he cannot allow his troops to see weakness. Biliath replies that there is hardness and there is cruelty. The troops fear him, and she would as well, if she wasn't able to rein back his worst ideas. She turned to look at her lover. He was distracted, fumbling with a small contraption made of drilled, burnished brass, stubby and cylindrical with a dish at the end. He crumbled something brown into the dish, then placed the other end into his mouth and lit a fire, melting whatever it was. When he exhaled again, it was heavy and tinged with red. He offered it to her gently, and she took a puff. It dulled the aching pains across her back, if only for a second. She blew the smoke back into his surprised face, and then he was coughing, and then she was laughing, and then they were both laughing and coughing, and the smoke was drifting out across Amoni Ram. They walked through the streets the next morning. Biliath had her meeting with General Maline at the garrison, and Ansul accompanied her. It didn't raise any eyebrows with the soldiers. He was still a prince, after all. It was a surprise to see him take an interest in military matters for once, but not an unwelcome one. The citizens, for their part, were happy just to see two paragons of the city out and about. It brought an air of reassurance, countering the silence from the palace. They made their way through the crowd, the two of them surrounded by a light accompaniment from the Imperial Guard. The crowd parted respectfully as they passed, stopping their bartering or purchasing or hawking to bow respectfully before the prince. The guardsmen saluted the Shahanshah as she passed. Ansul fidgeted awkwardly at the endless cavalcade of bows, remarking to Biliath that you'd think once would be enough. She replies that they don't see his father anymore, so their expectations in him fall to Ansul. He believes that to be unfair, as he's denied the role enough times already. If he wanted to rule, he would have asked his father to grant him a governance. She tells him that there's some duties you can't deny. Governor or not, he is their prince, and that comes with certain responsibilities. He believes that if this is what it means to be prince, then he's more than happy to let Kabar be the heir. She reminds him gently that Prince Kabar is not here, and he is. He replies by simply saying, "Unfortunately." She was glad the reverence from the crowd was loud enough to mask the hiss she let out. She stamped it down. A stupid, thoughtless comment. Nothing more. She put it outside of her mind until they arrived at the garrison. It was a vast, hulking complex in the western quarter of the city. High towers, gates manned by soldiers. On the plazas, daily drills and fitness checks were occurring, armored soldiers in formation marching and slashing their blades through the air in perfect synchronization with the drums. Officers shrieked out orders that quickly became "kneel" as the Shahanshah and the prince passed. She pulled one such officer aside, asking him where General Malin is. He replies that he's in the infirmary, but he doesn't know his condition. She released him and made a beeline for the infirmary, Ansul following earnestly behind. It was another large building. It had once been smaller, but recently it had been forced to integrate the surrounding buildings for need of space. She tried not to think about what that signified as she entered. The stench of stale blood and urine was immediate. She turned to Ansul, asking if he would like to wait outside, making sure to refer to him as her lord, as she was acutely aware of the presence of the Imperial Guard listening in. Ansul replies that he's quite alright, so they carry on, through the tiled corridors of the infirmary. Every room they passed contained bodies, most alive, some in more questionable state. Moaning and grunting echoed throughout the halls, of men healing and men dying. Surgeons rushed around them, pausing momentarily as they considered kneeling or saluting before Ansul hurriedly waved them off. A soldier passed by, carried on a stretcher by two orderlies. There was a gaping, ragged hole in his chest, turning a sickening yellow at the edges, ribs exposed. Struck by the Deva, no doubt. His eyes were fluttering, and he was sucking in air greedily. Ansul whispers Mekane's name, and Biliath calls back to him to not look. It killed her to say it, but she knew him. She knew he couldn't handle this. He had always been a softer soul, uninterested in martial affairs and disturbed by the sight of blood. Everything Kabar wasn't. It was part of why she loved him. Then she found herself face to face with Malin. He was a tall man, bearded, easily a foot and several pounds of muscle over her. Intimidating, but his face broke into a warm smile on seeing her. They exchanged salutes, then he knelt for the prince, who told him to rise, as there's no need for any of that. His face was pale, eyes wide, causing the general to ask him if he's all right. Ansul replies that he's just fine, so Malin nods and turns back to Biliath. He looked through the reinforcement request and says that resources are admittedly tight, but Tarat must fall if they are to hold the region. He's marshaled the men, and they're gathering outside the western gate, commanded by Kurna. She nodded, as she knew him to be a competent, skilled leader. Malin then lowers his voice, asking, off of the official report, how the siege is progressing. She thought for a second before looking back up at him, eyes hard. She states that she's seen men being commanded into a full front assault with no artillery cover against the gates of the city. She's seen aerial units pushed into suicide missions to destroy such significant targets as a farmer's hut. She's had her soldiers pulled from their camps and drowned in the night, beheaded and poisoned and run through and burned alive. She's had to walk the killing fields where they engage them in the day and use her blade to fulfill the no-quarter order herself because her men are tired of killing defenseless enemies. She's seen Haram and herself ignored time and time and time again for the sake of some imagined glory on the battlefield. She can tell him that there is no glory to be found at Tarat. Malin pursed his lips and states that he was afraid of that, asking if they can pull back, but she says no. At this point, they're dug in, and any siege in the winter will be even harder because the Deva will be prepared for it. The defenses will be even further hardened. They wasted their golden opportunity. Now the only thing they can do is absorb the losses and try to end it as fast as they can. Biliath didn't lower her voice. She was acutely aware of Anul behind her, quietly listening in the whole time. They were leaning against the outside of the western wall, some shade from the overhangs. It was a public spot, perhaps risky, but the reinforcements marshalling outside had departed some hours ago, and there was no one left around. The watchman on top of the wall couldn't see them in this nook, holding each other before she had to take to the skies again, to leave Amoni Ram once more. Biliath, the tip of her nose pressed against his, tells him that she hopes he understands now what she's protecting him from, that kind of horror and bloodshed, so he shouldn't say, unfortunately, that he's here instead of at the front. It was a soft admonishment, but a firm one, and she tells him that this is where he belongs, and that is where she belongs. He went quiet for a moment, before apologizing, saying that that's not what he meant. He meant that it was unfortunate that Kabar is at the front, causing both of them to go quiet. She asks if he understands then, and he replies that he's his brother. He loves him, but he understands how he can be, reckless and aggressive. She says that he's grown worse. He sends soldiers to suicide pushes for no reason other than to spite and distract the enemy. He refuses to listen to her or the other generals, and men die in droves as a result. She worries that she can't keep reining him in. He sighs and asks what choice do they have. Haram's words hung in her head, but she stamped them out and kissed the man she loved. She was coasting through the air back to Tarat when she first smelled it. Smoke. It was just the slight, bitter odor at first. Then it was everywhere, filling the air, filling her nose and her lungs, choking. She lapsed into a coughing fit, losing control of her glide, spiraling back down to earth. She barely managed to lift herself out of the dive at the last minute, landing on her shoulder. She heard the shearing of metal and cringed before her mind returned to the present. She was in a field of burning bodies. Corpses arranged neatly in rows and columns, coated in oil, burning, the stench of charred flesh inescapable. Biliath covered her nose and mouth, looking down at the Deva. Except they weren't Deva. These were humans, men stripped of their armor, most missing one limb or another, gold peeking through fissures in the skin. These were mechanites. And then the realization dawned on her in increasing horror. These were her mechanites, her men, her soldiers. She recognized their faces, the same faces she'd led into battle and rescued and commanded and dragged from the field. They were dead, burning, all killed the same way. Throats slit. The fires baked the blood to a dark stain on their brown skin. 200 at least. More behind the pillars of thick black smoke. Her jaw clenched. She hears her name from behind her, coming from Haram, and she turns, hands shaking with rage. He explains that after she left, Kabar ordered an assault on the city's weakest flank, the southeastern side of the city. She blinked, stating that that's directly across the water. Haram replies that it would require fording the river, and it would be a risky, dangerous, stupid maneuver under these conditions, fit only for a brute. So of course he ordered them to, and they rebelled. Haram looked out across the field of burning bodies before continuing. Her men told him that they wouldn't do it without their general there to lead them. They refused to get into formation, so he brought his cohort and the Imperial Guard down on them. Kabar had said that they fight or they're put to the sword. But of course, killing a quarter of your forces is too stupid even for him. So instead, once order was restored, he issued the order. Every unit selects one man among them and kills them. Her vision was blurry now, fury mixed with adrenaline, mixed with soot. She remarks in disbelief that he had them stripped, not referring to their clothes, but rather their prostheses. Burying a soldier without his arms and legs was among the greatest insults, reserved only for traitors. Her voice shakes as she says that all he had to do was wait a single day. She would have come back and led the charge. Haram replies that he's an animal, and with the Emperor comatose, he's broken his leash. They stood there for some time, the only sound the crackling of the fires. He asks if she sees it, a vision of the future under this emperor. Citizens put to the sword if they don't take up arms. The Imperial Guard treating women and children as they do enemies. Nothing but constant war. He was right. She could see it, rendered in perfect detail. Kabar on the Fulad throne, completely unstoppable. The Legion under his direct command, conscripting boys barely old enough to shave. Herself relegated to the life of a bird in a gilded cage in a burning house, watching him drive the Empire into ruin, helpless to do anything but cry out to deaf ears. Anul quietly killed or put in the dungeons to consolidate his rule. Amoni Ram burning just like the bodies of her soldiers, smoke spiraling up into the air endlessly. She gasped through the choking ash and states that it cannot be allowed to happen. Haram agrees, simply, that it can't, and she asks him what they should do. Haram replies dispassionately that they should do the same thing you do with any animal that's broken its leash. You cut it down before it does any more damage. Chapter 2. Anul stared up at the walls of the palace of Amoni Ram, seat of the Fulad throne, his erstwhile home. It was like a microcosm of the city that surrounded it, roughly circular, central to the city, to the empire, to the world. The walls were stone-hewn in the height of 4 men. Nothing compared to the great walls around the city, of course, but if those did fall, the palace would be protected. But that would never happen, because Amoni Ram would never fall. Anul approached the central gate to the palace, the Imperial Guard surrounding him. Their presence was like a pebble in his shoe, grating and inescapable. The taciturn, gold-masked soldiers answered to his father, nominally, though of course, now that meant very little. In practice, they took their orders from his mother, and she refused to let her son go without protection in times like these. After sufficient shouting, he had at least managed to negotiate some privacy. They were not to enter his private apartments. He was thankful for that small blessing, at least. It was difficult enough keeping his relationship with Biliath secret without the guard lurking outside his bedchambers. Part of why he had left the palace. Indeed, here they were lurking around every corner and in every shadow. Any secret was on a ticking timer, and one as dangerous and sinful as this. He raised a foulard hand to the guards at the gate. They knelt and pulled the massive, heavy metal gate open, calling him their lord. He ignored the pit in his stomach the supplication provoked, and passed into the central courtyard unassailed. It was a wide, open plaza. Courtiers and nobles and clerics with business in the palace milling about, hoping for an audience with the emperor that would never come. That was fine. They had a system worked out, he was told. More kneeling as he pressed swiftly on. More Imperial guardsmen at every doorway, stairwell, and arch. He entered into the inside corridors, cutting through reception halls and servant corridors and kitchens, putting his bodyguards through their paces. They may have been trained for this, but he had grown up in these halls, running wild through every nook and cranny of the palace. Chasing Kabar through servants' quarters and play wrestling in the laundry rooms and playing hide-and-go-seek in the storerooms. That had been a long time ago. But the memories still came, and with them the deep-rooted knowledge of the palace's layout. He let his muscles carry him to where he needed to go, and then he heard someone calling out to him. He would have ignored it, or offered a kind nod like he did for the 1,000 other voices, but it struck out in its familiarity. He turned and broke into a smile, greeting a man named Tarat. He reached forward and embraced the man warmly, pulling him into a hug. After a second, the servant returned it, somewhat hesitantly, stating that he's not sure that this is appropriate. Anul replies that he finds himself with less and less regard for what's appropriate by the day. He released the young man, brushing the dust off of his shoulders. He was a few years younger than Anul, simple beige tunic and thick beard making a sharp contrast against his own red-dyed robes and clean-shaven cheeks. A few servants around might have looked on in surprise at a member of the imperial family embracing a servant in the tunnels of the palace, but the imposing presence of the Imperial Guard sent them on their way quickly enough. Tarat called after them, shouting that they can see he told them nothing but truth. Anul asks what stories he's been feeding them, to which he just says that the prince owes him his life, and of their adventures fighting rebels at Ram. Anul laughs and says that he wanders ever closer to earning the ire of someone important, but Tarat claps him on his shoulder and says not anymore. He remarks that it's been ages and asks what brings him home. As they start walking down the corridor, Anul replies that it hasn't been home for a long time. Tarat comments on the rumors flying around the servant quarters, that Prince Anul has left the palace because the Imperial Guard is plotting on his life. Prince Anul has taken control of an entire tower to take quarter in with his thousands of mechanical oddities, and Prince Anul has cracked the curse of the mechanical mind and made himself a foulard lover. An image struck Ansul of Biliath's flawless, beautiful gold and foulard wings spread around the pair as they embraced, cradling the two of them. He stamped it down and laughed along with his friend, stating that it's nothing quite so tawdry, just privacy. Tarat asks what really brings him here, to which Ansul replies that he must see his parents. Tarat went quiet, before saying that he's sorry about Ansul's father, but the prince tells him not to be, as they all return to Mecane sooner or later. Well, Tarat replies that he's not dead yet. Ansul thinks to himself that he might be better off if he was. Tarat says that he won't hold him here then, as he has his own duties to attend to as well. He bowed deeply, and then he was gone, disappearing into the maze of shadowy corridors and passages he knew like the back of his hand. Tarat's father was the vizier, not the grand vizier, whose domain extended throughout the empire and was a landed noble, but the palatial vizier, whose domain covered the palace grounds and was formerly just another servant. The palace was a living, breathing entity, a constantly shifting web of allegiances and loyalties. It was the palatial vizier's duty to keep a finger on this erratic pulse, to report any significant changes or news flitting around the kitchens and laundries and workhouses to the ear of the emperor, and it was these skills that he had passed down to his son. As a boy, Ansul had been told not to play with the servants, but in practice, no one looked hard enough to stop him. When Kabar had begun spending more time in the garrison, learning the arts of combat and war, Ansul had shifted to spending more time with the vizier's boy. Tarat, cheerful, easygoing, disarmingly charming, had earned his parents' tentative approval, and the farther Kabar drifted, the closer the two became, until he left the palace. Ansul shook the thoughts away, hand on the metal ring of the door as he heard the voices inside. He tugged it open, slipping inside the Hall of Lions. It was a reception room, smaller and a little more private than the main throne room. He drifted into the curtained shadows near the rear and watched the proceedings. Empress Helena was standing by the chaise, tall and in a long, thin white dress imported from the eastern provinces. The gold of her foulard legs shone through it. She hadn't seen him yet, and he elected to keep it that way, sticking to the shadows outside her cone of view, which was focused entirely on the man in front of her. Some minor shah from the western provinces, complaining of banditry against his farms, asking for a detachment from the Legion to quell the raids. He watched the Empress's hand snake down, almost imperceptibly, to the shoulder of the man lying in the chaise. His father, her husband, Haith Bumaro, Emperor of the Broken Empire, Lord of the Foulard Throne, the most powerful man in the known world. He was reclining weakly against the padded chaise, skin pale, wrinkled, heavily spotted. His eyes were covered by a thin film of milky white, making it impossible to see what he was focusing on, if anything. His hair had long since fallen out, but his beard was perfectly manicured. It was strange for a noble to keep whiskers, much less the emperor, but it had been a tactical decision by his wife so audiences would not see his hanging lip collecting saliva. His body was draped in expensive robes to hide the extent of his augmentations, but still they peeked up around his neck and over his collar. Rebreathers, pace setters, air filters, his entire left ear replaced, no doubt more under the robes. Augmentations were a sign of devotion, but this was far beyond mere augmentation. This was life support. He breathed heavily, not noticing or responding to the Shah's supplications. And then Helena's hand snaked down and clasped his shoulder twice, and something in the Bumaro's mind triggered, and shakingly he shook his head no. The Duke's face fell, and Helena stepped forward. She tells the Shah that the Legion is preoccupied with the war effort, which takes priority, but they sympathize with his plight. A supply of their weapons will be dispatched, so his farmers will be armed to protect themselves. She then dismisses him, but the Shah protests that he traveled here to speak to the Emperor, not to hear his wife. Her eyes lit up with indignant rage, and Ansul hurriedly stepped out of the shadows. Several sets of eyes turned to him, passing through confusion, then recognition, then surprise. He tells the Shah that she speaks with the full authority of the Fulad throne, and he would do well to remember that. The man's indignation evaporated, and he slunk back out of the door with his attendants. When the door closed behind him, he barely had time to turn around before Helena embraced him tightly, kissing his cheeks with gold-colored lips. She says that finally, he returns, and even if it's only for the afternoon, it's more than he's given her until now. She released him, and they both turned. His father was still on the chaise, not acknowledging Ansul's presence. His mother gently prodded him forward, and he knelt, gently grasping and kissing his father's hand. Ansul was not a strong man, but his father's fingers felt like paper in his grip. It would take a minuscule action of the muscle for his father's hand to rest on his hand, or stroke his cheek, the barest hint of conscious movement to signify something was alive inside. Nothing came. Just the sound of the rebreathers sucking air into dead lungs. Ansul blinked away the disappointment as he rose. He'd long since spent his tears. He stood with his mother in silence, both unwilling to state the obvious, that they were looking at a dead man. Ansul asks if he'll abdicate to Kabar when he returns, and his mother nods. She states that the Empire needs an emperor fit to rule, and Kabar will return a hero. Ansul comments that the stories he hears from Tarat say otherwise, and Helena shoots him a look. She tells him not to denigrate his brother, as he leads an army against an impossible foe. Ansul replies that he knows that, but the casualty reports are staggering. Helena just says that that is the Deva's fault, not his, and for a split second her refusal to even question Kabar's leadership struck him, and doubt wormed its way into his chest. Was this how he sounded to Biliath? He remarks that Kabar will need to take a wife when he returns, to ensure there is an heir to the throne. He prods gently, asking if he mentioned anyone to her before leaving. Helena replies simply that his first wife will be Biliath, of course, as tradition demands the Shahansha of the Legion submit to her emperor. He tried not to betray how his heart wilted, instead saying that Kabar was never one for tradition. Helena agrees that he isn't in all things, but certainly in this. He is quite fixated on her, and has said that he intends to have her upon his ascension. Ansul asks why he waits instead of just marrying her now, but Helena replies that princes marry, while emperors take concubines. It seems that he does not want Biliath as his empress, merely in his harem. She can't say she approves, but she just sighs and shrugs. A concubine? Taking his love, not even as his proper wife, not as the empress, but as a concubine? Biliath was the smartest, bravest soul Ansul had ever met. Locking her away in the harem with a dozen others, purposeless save for producing heirs. It was beyond a waste. It was an insult to her very being. She deserved the palace. She deserved the empire. She deserved the world itself, not to be some fool's pleasure slave. Ansul forced his fists to relax, for his breathing to calm. Alana tells him that he ought to find a woman of his own sooner or later. He has a duty to the family, and he cannot wait for the perfect princess to cross his path. He ignores the bile rising in his throat, and instead just replies that he will. Alana asks him why he asks about Kabar, to which he just says, curiosity. Biliath is a powerful commander, and he can't help but wonder if she's not better served on the battlefield than in the Haram house. She doesn't disagree, but when Kabar is on the throne, he may do as he wishes. The only one that could prevent him is the High Authority of Mecane. The High Authority of Mecane, the Emperor himself. It was a sick joke. He cast a long glance at his dying father, reclining on the chaise, wheezing and sucking in air, milky eyes focused on nothing at all. The wise and just ruler of Amoni Ram. In Biliath's tent, which offered a little bit more privacy from prying eyes and ears, she tells Haram that she hasn't committed to anything yet. He nods and says that that's fine, as he wouldn't expect her to. Biliath walked around him, ensuring the tent flap was sealed shut, then sat down on the edge of her cot. She asks what he has in mind, to which he says that he needs to be removed, as that is no longer in question. Biliath replies that he's not talking about removal, though, he's talking about killing. Haram states that that's the only option, but she shakes her head, saying that there must be another way. Her duty is to protect him, vile as he is. Haram is asking her to compromise on that, and to compromise herself. Haram in turn asks if she thinks that this is easy for him, but she says that they occupy different positions. She is not simply another general, as she has a higher calling. They stared daggers at each other for a second, before Haram's voice softened, telling her that her duty isn't to protect him, it's to protect the Empire, and to protect the throne. She replies that that means protecting its heir, but he counters by saying not if him sitting on the throne will bring about its destruction. She opened her mouth to say that they couldn't be sure, but thought better of it. She'd seen the vision, Amoni Ram burning. She'd seen the bodies, her men, put to the sword, bodies arranged neatly in as honorable a grave their comrades could get away with arranging them in, skin soaked in oil, burning hot and fast. Kabar on the throne meant the fall of the Empire. She knew it in every pore of her body, in her bones. She asks Haram what it would entail if she did agree, which she doesn't. Haram reached under his breastplate, pulling out a small leather pouch. He undid the string, drawing out its contents. A small, corked vial, no bigger than his thumb, containing a shimmering white liquid. He explains that on his campaign in the east, they managed to encircle a small Deva fort, one with a priestess still inside. They outnumbered the Deva 5-1. Her soldiers surrendered against her orders, and they swept through the fort as fast as they could. He found the priestess in her shelter, with this raised to her lips. He tore it out of her hand and corked it, but not before she managed to suck down a single drop. He swirled the liquid around. It caught the light magnificently. He continues, saying that he's never seen someone in such pain take so long to die. They had her as their prisoner for at least 2 weeks. She bled out of every orifice. She vomited up her organs. Thorns escaped her skin. She went blind a few days in, and he was hoping she would go mute. All she would do was either moan prayers to her heathen god or beg him for the rest of the vial. Whispered half mad that if she was given the whole thing, it'd kill her instantly, painlessly. Biliath asks if he did. to which he just passes her the vial, with it almost full to the brim. She asks if they just slip this into his water then, but Haram shakes his head. They'd never get the chance, as the Imperial Guard keep far too close of an eye on his food and drink. And even if they did, suspicion would immediately fall on them, especially after his decimation of her forces. She replies that she wouldn't confess, but he says that it doesn't matter. He had some run-ins with the Imperial Guard when he was still at the garrison. They have ways of pulling the truth from your lips that don't require your cooperation. She states that she's not going to drag a lower officer into this plot, with even the word having a dirty ring to it. Haram replies that she doesn't have to, as it can't be anyone here. She saw what the Imperial Guard did to her men. They had no hesitation putting 100 men to the sword. If the dog dies here and now and they suspect treachery, it will be open war. He has no idea how many may die, and the siege will be lost. Even if they survive, if they kill the Imperial Guard, they will be unwelcome in Amoni Ram so long as their heads are still attached to their necks. Biliath purses her lips, calling it a dangerous situation. Haram agrees and says that it can't be either of them and it can't be here. It needs to be after he returns to Amoni Ram for his triumph, and it needs to be someone no one would ever suspect. Someone utterly beyond reproach and suspicion. Someone who can assert control over the Empire in the chaos and serve as a unifying figure with the support of the Legion and the clergy. Biliath cocks her head at him, saying that she hopes he doesn't mean himself. Haram doesn't so much as crack a smile and says no. She asks who then, and he doesn't say anything, eyes closed for a moment, steeling himself. She asks again, and he opens his eyes, his gaze falling upon her. He tells her that he still has his spies in Amoni Ram, and he knows about her and Prince Anul. The bottom fell out of her stomach, and she begins to stutter, but he cuts her off, telling her to afford him the respect of not lying to him at least. He was right, and there was no point denying what he knew. Like a switch, the stuttering stopped, and she took command, like she was born to. She asks him how they found out, but he just says that that's not important. He knows that she has the ear of the prince, and he listens to her counsel. She has some power over him. The shock of the revelation was quickly replaced by new disbelief as she processed what Haram was intimating. She was glad the vial was in her flesh hand, her foulard fist clenched tightly enough to shatter it. She asks him in anger if he's lost his mind, and hisses that this is already high treason. He's made her an accomplice just by telling her, and now he wants to drag the prince in. Haram simply replies that there's no one else, and it has to be Prince Anul. Biliath counters that he abhors violence and loves his brother. He won't hear a bad word against Kabar, and he wants to try and convince him to descend to Fratricide. Haram replies that he wants her to convince him actually, and she leans back in disbelief. She says that she will not, and that he's gone mad. Haram sets his jaw and asks if that's how it is then. When she says yes, he sighs and says that he didn't want to do this. Her hand quietly snaked to the dagger hanging from her belt, unhooking it from its loop. He tells her to relax, as he's not going to hurt her, but she has to do this. She doesn't have a choice. She replies that he had said she always has a choice, and he agrees. She does have a choice. She can do this, or word of her tryst can leak out to the Imperial Guard. Her blood went cold. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out, and Haram leapt on the opportunity. He tells her that she'd be executed for treason, of course, and Prince Anul would be forced to watch as the Imperial Guard tore her prosthetics off, leaving her to bleed out for hours in the sand, her lover forbidden from interfering. It'll almost be a mercy when she finally dies, except it won't, because her dying thought will be the knowledge that now they're going to go to work on him. Her throat was tightening. She could see it. Foulard limbs brutally ripped off, leaving her to writhe in the dust of the Court of Rubies. Ragged, bloody limbs leaking blood for hours, staining the sand red, letting the courtyard earn its name once again. Prince Ansul watching, vomiting, tears streaming from his eyes, the figure behind him holding a dagger against his windpipe, golden eyes alight with bloodlust. Kabar. Bloodlust that wouldn't be quenched when she died. No, Haram was right. She pleads with him that they'd torture Ansul for months, picking his limbs apart, making him bleed. He couldn't bear that, and neither could she, and she pauses before saying that Ansul loves him, and he's like family to him. For a moment, she thought she detected a softness in Haram's eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a tired cruelty. He replies that every maneuver Kabar makes costs them half a unit. Dozens of men, dead, forever, and this bloodshed is a drop compared to the ocean that will be spilled if he takes the throne. Tens of thousands of men, dead. Thousands of families in Amoni Ram, Ram, Ulma Ram, across the empire, left fatherless every single day. He's sorry, but her life isn't worth more than theirs. Nor is Ansul's, nor is his own. No one's is. She was gasping down air now, trying to press away the visions of Ansul, back ripped open, screaming in the dungeons of the palace as the Imperial Guard set to work with their scalpels and screws and blades. All she could say was that Haram is a bastard, but he just replies that war makes bastards of us all. And then they were sitting in silence, before he tells her that he'll give her 2 days to make her decision. And then he was gone, and Biliath was alone. She rose to her feet. She was exhausted. The flight from Amoni Ram, seeing the burning bodies, this. Trying to put thoughts together now was like marching through knee-deep mud. But some small part of her mind pointed out what a perfect setup this was for a loyalty test by Kabar. An experiment to gauge his favorite bird's commitment to her master. She didn't think Haram would do that, but if it was a loyalty test, they wouldn't give her real poison. She inspected the vial. Gingerly, she uncapped it. A pale white vapor drifted out, and she kept it far away from her nose. She strode to the cage in the far corner of the tent, popping the latches and looking in. She selected the first beast she saw. The biggest, the alpha of the litter, the one that pushed its brethren around for food, and snatched it up, grabbing it in her fist as it squirmed around. One drop had been enough to ensure a long, slow, painful death for the priestess. But the priestess would have been a human, and this beast was barely the size of her fist. Surely one drop would be more than enough. She squeezed the beast again, forcing its maw open, and carefully tipped a drop from the vial into its mouth before dropping it back into the cage. The vial was corked and put away under her breastplate. And then she watched. It hopped around fine for the first few minutes, seemingly confused by the whole experience. Then it trembled, shook a bit, then undulated as it kept squirming around. It made a cry, and she saw flecks of blood in its spit. And it keeled over, and it was dead. Its brothers were starting to inspect the corpse, and she quickly disposed of it. It was real. This was no loyalty test. She stumbled to her cot and fell into it. In the half moment before sleep took her, she thought she heard a scream sound out far across the camp, but then she was gone. Anul squinted at the machine in front of him. It was one of hundreds of little machines scattered around the apartment. There was no registry of their functions or parts. All of it was committed to his memory. This one lay in front of him, half disassembled, mechanical guts spilling onto his workbench. He sighed, putting down the tools. This was meant to be a miniaturization of the massive machines that the clerics used for recording memories and knowledge. Those mechanisms were the size of a room. This was about the size and shape of a human head. If it worked, it would make the memory cylinder technology freely available for the citizenry, easing communication and logistics. Unfortunately, it didn't work. He'd been trying to fix it for several hours now, and the magnifying lens was beginning to take a toll on his vision. He slipped the goggles off, rising from his bench and heading to the window. He watched the skies, hopeful beyond hope, but was inevitably disappointed. No Biliath, swooping down on metal wings to embrace him. Oh well. She would return soon enough. The apartment was stifling now. Hundreds of machines occupying every surface and shelf, most half-finished and bereft of drive. It was hard to think in, and so he escaped, slipping on his cloak and taking the elevator down, flanked by his guards, exiting out into the city streets, walking without a direction in mind. When mechanisms did make it out of his quarters, they were lauded. The platinum steel casing that had made the fusion reactors under the city twice as efficient. The new generation of automata that made the labor of the market that much easier. His presentations at the academy had earned him his title, High Scholar of the Imperial Cult. The clergy was as much about technology as it was religious studies, and Anul had always excelled at both. The old texts had illuminating knowledge on creation, if one knew how to read them for it. But that was a long time ago, and he hadn't presented anything in a long time. The clerics had little interest in civil engineering now. As Crown Prince, Kabar set its direction, and its direction these days was engines of war. Machines to bring down walls, to vaporize armies, to burn cities. Tools of death. Anul was no idiot. He realized that if they lost the war, there would be no more creations, civil or otherwise. The Deva and the Nalka would see Amoni Ram brought to its knees. Still, the neglect of the city put a bad taste in his mouth. The transit systems were suffering. The waterways needed maintenance, yet the Academy produced more siege engines, more cannons, more bombs. He blinked as he found himself in the Academy courtyard. He hadn't been thinking consciously, and his feet had taken him here of their own accord. The courtyard had been bustling once. Clerics and academics milling about, exchanging ideas under the looming shadow of the Academy building. It was quieter nowadays. And in the middle of the open plaza sat Bumaro's tree. Plants were unfashionable in Amoni Ram now. The war with the Deva had soured the people on the once great gardens. No one wanted to return from the front, from the sight of sorcerer Nawabs splitting men apart with vines, of living trees marching across the battlefield screaming godless cries, to see the same lush greenery from their nightmares. The farming was relegated to outside the city walls, and the gardens were dug up or simply left to wither. But the tree was exceptional, and the emperor at the time had granted it a pardon. Its trunk was as tall as 6 men, as thick as 3, and made of overlapping bark and foulade. It was a marvel of biotechnics, a practice that had similarly fallen out of favor due to the Nalka. But in its infancy, the tree, said to have been the tree kept fertilized by the droppings of the sheep of Bumaro I, was split apart and implanted with a foulade seed. As the tree grew, so too did the foulade, and the result was a magnificent half-metal, half-bark marbling, shining metallic gold and green leaves. But today a cleric had a ladder, and was taking a pair of clippers to one of the foulade branches of the tree. Anul greets him, causing the cleric to spin around, shocked as he awkwardly descended the ladder to kneel. Anul cuts off his apology and says that he's fine, asking what he's doing. The cleric replies that the tree has come under affliction from rust rot, causing Anul to frown. He had written his thesis at the academy on rust rot, a creeping, corrosive fungus that found a home on improperly maintained metals, including foulade, slowly eating through it. He asks why cut it then, as there are chemical baths to treat rust rot, to which the cleric replies that the biotechnical nature of the tree complicates matters. The chemical baths would risk poisoning the organic half of the tree, killing it, but the rust rot threatens the foulade half, if they allow it to spread. Anul calls it an unfortunate predicament, and the cleric nods, saying that this has been recorded previously in the archives. Sometimes an unhealthy branch must be culled to allow the tree's survival. Anul, however, raises a hand and tells him to leave it as it is for today. Rust rot is known to eat itself alive sometimes, disappearing as quickly as it comes, and he'd hate to damage the tree if they don't have to. The cleric hesitates, but agrees, before bowing his head and returning to the ladder to pack up his tools. Anul stared at the tree and frowned. Biliath strode through the camp, acutely aware of the eyes on her. Hundreds of soldiers, huddled by their fires, staring at her as she stepped around their clustered tents and over those sleeping in the mud. It was raining again, a slight drizzle. Not enough to extinguish the fires, but enough to lend a wet, tired air to everything. The eyes were piercing, burning. She was used to this. Soldiers looking to her for leadership, for guidance, for commands. She was their shepherd, and they depended on her judgment as much as she depended on their loyalty. And in this entire campaign, both had always given what they had and gotten what they needed. Until now. Now the eyes carried with them a new, unfamiliar, uncomfortable feeling. Betrayal. Disappointment. She didn't know how to deal with that, and so she pushed it away, not lowering her eyes, even as the soldier leading her ducked into the large tent. The scent of stale blood hit her, as familiar now as it had been in the infirmary in Amoni Ram. Cots lined up against the wall, bodies placed in them. Most dead, some still on their way. The results of a disastrous distance attack by the Deva against a weakened flank of the camp. Usually, they were far enough away to miss, or to be shot down by the artillerymen before they came close. Usually. Maybe 30 men lay there, moaning prayers in their last breaths. She stepped past their cots, inspecting them. One man with his face charred into blackened flesh, mouth and nose drooping as though liquefied. One man whose limbs had been constricted by vines, turning the flesh below them a sickening shade of purple, the flesh dying. One man who had been the unlucky victim of an explosion, the entire left side of his body blown off. His corpse lay in the cot, more at peace than any of his comrades. Another, and another, and another. A tableau of vomit-inducing scenes. Biliath wasn't affected by gore much. Not anymore. But something in her chest twisted on inspecting them. She walked between the bodies of the dead and the dying, whispering prayers and last rites and closing open eyes. She wasn't a cleric. Not really. But it was better than nothing. Then she heard a thump and turned. One man laying on a cot in the far corner of the tent, bleeding from his eyes, fist raised to his chest. Thump thump. A salute. He was saluting her. Another man close to him echoed the salute, and another, and then those in the tent that were still alive and had the use of their arms were pounding their chests and saluting her, their general, their leader, the one who would do anything to protect them. Her vision blurred, and a dull buzzing filled her ears as she moved, legs carrying her mechanically out of the rear of the tent and into the rain. She leaned over and vomited. When she came around the tent, the eyes fell on her again. Hundreds of soldiers, crouching, huddled around fires, staring at their commander, waiting for an answer. There was no avoiding it. She owed it to them, this and so much more. She tells them that she wasn't there, and she's sorry. She wasn't there, and she should have been. Her gaze washed around the endless crowd of men, the army she was in charge of. Young men with hopeful faces, older men with weary faces, rain washing over them all. It would be trivial for them to desert, to slip away during the chaos of a charge and make their way to the steppe or the west or any of the other lower cities, to abandon their comrades, to abandon her. And yet here they were, unflinchingly ready to lay down their lives for her. Haram was right. These were thousands of men, thousands of lives, thousands of families. They'd put her and the Empire above their wives, their lovers, their children. She owed them the same. Her grip tightened on the pommel of her sword. She states, "For the living and the dead, never again," and raises a fist, pounding it against her breastplate. Thump thump. Thump thump, the echo of 1,000 salutes, echoing out across the camp, through the valley. At the gravesite of her fallen men, Haram approaches Biliath, saying that he thought he might find her here. The rain had come, extinguishing the fires, turning the soft dirt to red-streaked mud. She didn't have to wonder where the red came from. She answers that it's a good reminder of what lies in their future. Traitors to the Empire. Traitors to Amoni Ram. Haram cuts her off with a simple no, the sharpness of which catches her off guard. He tells her that they're doing this for the Empire, and for Amoni Ram. Every life he's taken, every drop he's spilled, it's been for the Fulad throne. This is no different. They listened to the rain pound the mud around them for some time. She almost whispers to him that her duty is to protect the Empire. How does one square that with this? Haram replies that it's war. You can't protect everyone, and Mekane knows Kabar has divested himself of her protection. She says that she wasn't talking about Kabar, and he understands. There's another pause before he speaks again, his voice heavy. He says that he likes Prince Anul. He's a good boy, soft-spoken and gentle. She nods without lifting her eyes from the corpses, and she agrees. He couldn't muster a hand against a scorpion if it bit him, and that's why she loves him. Haram says that a gentle ruler is a luxury, one they don't have in wartime. She can't protect him from the world forever. His hands are going to get bloody sooner or later, and it's better if it's someone else's blood than his own. They lapsed into silence again. The bodies were disappearing now, sinking in the mire, the mud swallowing them. For the living and the dead. Biliath then says that she'll do it. Haram asks if she's sure, To which she replies that she doesn't think she has a choice. There's plenty of story left at this point, but things are not well in the Mechanite civilization. Between an alien emperor and his two sons who couldn't be more different, things are certainly going to come to a head soon enough. As for who lives, who dies, and who ends up ruling the Empire, we'll have to find out in Part 2.